Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I am your host, Dr. Kishore Volodi. And today we are so excited to be joined by Rose Reif, who is going to be explaining to us a topic that may be kind of hard for us to hear and talk about, because it means that there are things that are going to go on in the lives of our loved ones with Down syndrome that can sometimes bring grief. And it's a very real part of life, including in the life of those who we love with Down syndrome. So if you don't mind, Rose, if you could share who you are, what you do, and why you love working with this population.
Sure. So I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor working out of North Carolina, where I have a private practice. But many years ago, like 20 years ago, I started working in the field with folks with Down syndrome and other disabilities. I was a case manager at the time. I was managing group homes and running an independent living program. And in that role, I came to see that there were just not a lot of mental health services specifically for adults. That, kind of after the age of 18, 22, everything just fell off. And so I worked in that role for about 10 years and realized there really just wasn't much out there. So that prompted me to go back to school. I got a master's in rehabilitation counseling, which is a field of counseling really specifically geared towards working with folks with a variety of disabilities. And then I started a private practice. And so originally set out just intending to work with people with Down syndrome, work with people with other sorts of developmental disabilities. And then, maybe, 6 months or so into practice, I started to hear a lot from parents who would say, look, I heard you speak on a podcast like this one, or I read something that you wrote, and I feel like you understand maybe more than other therapists have a little bit about what my struggle is raising a child who has a disability. And so it sort of occurred to me, oh, this is this whole other area of unmet need, this other population who has really unique mental health challenges that aren't very well understood by most therapists. So now 10 years after that, that's who I work with in my practice. It's about a 50-50 mix of adults who have a variety of disabilities and then parents raising kids of all ages. And so in that, career span as a case manager, running group homes, and then certainly as a mental health therapist, this is a topic that I've seen come up time and time again, that, parents and professionals who are supporting someone who loves someone who has Down syndrome, it's really tricky. How do I talk about grief? How do I make it okay for a person to express their sadness without, maybe giving the impression that it's okay to always be sad? I know that's a real fear that parents have. I don't want to make things worse by explaining something wrong or saying something wrong. And I'm sure we'll get into more detail, but there are some really common traps that parents tend to fall into, thinking that it's better to say nothing, for fear of saying the wrong thing. And so, it's just an area that I've been really passionate about and have gotten to see in a lot of different ways throughout my career.
Yeah, and I think because of what you do and because of the work that I do too, you probably have heard, just like I have heard many times, especially regarding our friends with Down syndrome, that, well, of course they're always happy. What do you mean grief? So give our listeners, who probably many of them may have a loved one with Down syndrome, give our listeners a little bit of an idea of the truth or not truth of a statement like that.
So it sounds ridiculous when you really know a person who has Down
Yes.
syndrome, because you're like, well, of course they get angry and upset and sad and experience the full range of human emotion. But I do get where that comes from too, because it can be true that you can say to a person with Down syndrome, I'm so sorry, your mother has died. And their first question may be, well, what's for lunch? Right? It may seem like there's a disconnect. And I think a lot of people misinterpret that, because obviously we know folks with Down syndrome need a lot of repetition, need really concrete language, and need kind of ongoing education, especially about really abstract things, which death is certainly one of those, right? And so in the absence of that, it can sort of take a moment. And we have some research that says it can take even up to like 6 months sometimes for the reality to sink in of, the true loss of a person, whether that's, because it's a direct support professional who's moved on to a different job, or a family member or a pet who has died. So, I would encourage people who are thinking that way, that, oh, they're always happy, to ask themselves, well, could it be that maybe we just haven't done a very good job of explaining what is death? What do we do and say when someone has died? And help the person really understand what that means for them.
I guess, and in your experience, what have you found, particularly, let's say, with adults, young adults with Down syndrome, their ability to conceptualize or understand death? You were talking about using concrete, examples and words. Can you give us just a bit of an idea more what you mean by that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you think about the ways we talk about death, it makes sense. We're usually trying to protect ourselves. We tend to go for really euphemistic language, really vague, abstract things. He passed away, right? That's kind of the classic. But I remember talking with a young man who his parents were very concerned. He didn't seem to understand that his grandmother had died. And then I realized how they were explaining to him was to say, well, she has cancer and she lost the fight, right? And so I'm sitting talking with him, and I said, that's really interesting. She lost the fight. Who did she lose the fight with? And he said, I guess the cable company. She fights with them a lot.
Oh boy.
And so we realized it just hadn't been explained very clearly to him that, your grandmother has died, and when a person dies, that means their body isn't alive anymore. They aren't going to be able to hug you or drive a car or eat lunch with you or do any of those things. Their body is not going to move again. And so that can sound really kind of clinical. And I get that can be a hard way to talk about things, but I find that it's really helpful when we do speak in those very concrete terms. Or just use real world examples. If we see a plant or an animal out in the world that has died, kind of stopping and explaining, well, how is this plant different from one that's alive? How is this squirrel different from one that's climbing a tree, right? And give kind of opportunities throughout the person's life to understand what death is, I think can be really helpful.
And thank you. That's really, that's very helpful. And as you're thinking about experiences that you've had with your clients and trying to explain death, and they go through a grieving process, like what recommendations do you give to families and caregivers to help them process their grief? I'll give you an example. Just personally, my brother has Down syndrome. When my grandparents died, this was probably 25 to 30 years ago now. He took it really hard. He kept thinking about it, talking about it, perseverating on it. And even to this day, decades later, he'll say, you remember when they died? And he'll talk about it. And or if one of his friends has some loved one that dies, he likes to, he'll bring it up. Oh, you remember how your mom died? And I don't know, kind of what are some of the ways that you would tell a caregiver to kind of help somebody with Down syndrome process that grief effectively?
Sure. So the number one tip that I have, if listeners take nothing else away, please take this. I talk to so many family members who are afraid to grieve in front of someone with Down syndrome. They're worried I'll upset them more. They won't understand. I'll traumatize them. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? And we have to think about, the people we love who have Down syndrome, they don't have a lot of natural opportunities to socialize and talk about these kind of circumstances. A lot of the activities they may be doing are going to be very structured, right? So they don't have a ton of opportunities for just kind of spontaneous conversation. So a lot of what you show them at home may be their only education. So showing them that, of course it's okay to cry when we're sad. Of course it's okay to say, it's really hard for me to open dad's closet because the sweaters still smell like him and that smell reminds me of him, right? To make those kinds of things okay. And then the, kind of counterbalance to that being times where it's maybe not okay to bring that up, right? And giving them more expansive language to talk about their emotions. I do find that people will, my clients who have Down syndrome will do things like, maybe a friend, somebody broke up with them, right? And they'll start talking about someone who died. And what they're trying to say is, I feel sad the way that I felt when someone died. but they don't quite have the language to do that. So they just revert to talking about the deaths, right? And it's a way, okay, are you feeling sad the way you felt then? And it becomes a segue.
Yeah.
This may be a little off topic, but another just big tip I want to give in terms of communication
Yeah.
would be, I always teach families to teach the person with Down syndrome to say the actual date that their loved one died. Rather than saying, he died last Christmas, he died in September, because a lot of us conversationally, like, we can move the benchmark, right? We can do the math and say that was 5 Christmases ago now. But I find that a lot of folks with Down syndrome, after a while, that kind of recalculation just stops.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll be saying, grandma died 2 years ago, but it was actually 10 years ago.
Right.
And that can be really confusing, especially if you have, other paid caregivers involved, that kind of thing. So just another communication strategy that I find is really helpful.
That is helpful. Yeah. And do you find that remembering the date itself helps them to conceptualize the amount of time that has passed then? Okay.
I do, and
Yeah.
it helps too. I have this one client who I adore, who I see once a year, only one day a year. And it's the day that his mother passed away. And he comes to my office and he likes to do a little, empty chair exercise. He tells his mom, sitting in an empty chair, all the things he's done that year, and all the things she would be proud of. And it's just this lovely, significant day for him. There are, of course, other days that tend to be really significant, whether that's holidays, birthdays, special days within the family, that kind of thing. But the date of the death is certainly a big one. So finding ways to commemorate that, kind of keeps it on everyone's mind when you say the actual date.
That's really helpful. In fact, personally helpful. And I was sharing about my brother, everything happened a couple of years ago. That's what he always says. So when you said 2 years, I was like, that's so funny that you said that, because any of my family members listening will be like, yes, everything happened a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, very helpful. So as you are meeting with families, counseling families, are there particular resources that you recommend to them? Because as I'm sure you know better than maybe any of us, is the ability to find mental health resources is hard by itself. And then to find mental health resources that would be helpful for your loved one with Down syndrome is even more of a challenge. And so
yes.
What are some resources that you might recommend to families?
Yeah, so it's really tricky because, you want to strike that right balance between what's developmentally appropriate, but then also what might be age appropriate, especially if we're talking about someone who's older. There are a handful of books that are really good that I like. One of them is actually a Mr. Rogers book. I think it's called When a Pet Dies. It's just really good, uses that very concrete language. And I have a lot of clients who I'll share that with who will come back to that again and again. So that one just seems to be especially resonant. The other thing that I find can be really helpful, even if a family is in the position of kind of anticipating that a death may be coming up, to create some of their own resources, is to use like a social story format. And for folks who aren't familiar, that's a tool that was developed originally to help autistic people, but now we've seen that it can be really helpful for people with Down syndrome as well. And it's basically just a personalized story. And there are some like technical, formats to follow that can make it especially helpful. And that's very easy to Google and find lots of examples. But essentially it gives the person a real sense of agency of, if I'm going to be in an unexpected situation, what are some things that I can do? How can I ask for help if I need help? I actually find that those kind of more personalized resources tend to be more helpful, especially because, it may be, oh, I'm going to an uncle's house where I've been lots of times, but now somebody's there in hospice, and that means I can't run around and watch TV loud and do all the things I'm used to doing there. So it is, in effect, an unfamiliar situation. So that's definitely a strategy I recommend for a lot of families.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, as we do a podcast like this, obviously you work with this type of situation in this population so frequently, and for us, who either as people who provide care for people with Down syndrome, or family member or someone with Down syndrome. This isn't a topic where we'd like to think about our loved one or loved ones, being in that position, but it's almost the inevitability of living life. And so I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about this topic today. What are some things that you would want to make sure that if we haven't touched on it yet, anything that you would want to make sure that our audience is aware of, that you would want, maybe even as a parting thought from this podcast, or things that you would want to make sure that the people remember?
Sure. So as I'm sure you can imagine, listeners can imagine, there's not a ton of research on this. But what we do have research-wise is actually pretty clear about the fact that a lot of people with Down syndrome can understand death, that realistically, even if they can't, they can understand that somebody who used to be there all the time isn't there anymore, right? So at some level, even if you're not dealing with it verbally, you're going to be dealing with it, right? So I find that making it part of the conversation from an early age is an extremely helpful thing for families to do. Because the other thing that can happen is, if you don't do that, your child's going to put things together from, like popular media. And those aren't necessarily helpful resources, right? I worked with one young man whose brother had died, and he would say, this is just like Thor and Loki in the Marvel movies, and my brother's playing a trick on me, and he's going to come back, right? Because in superhero movies, people die, and then inevitably they're back in the next movie, right? So not a great resource for giving people clear understanding of what death means. And so I do encourage families that obviously it's a difficult topic, but one that can be part of the conversation from a young age. Again, to give your child that opportunity for repetition and learning. The other thing that we know from research is that when there is a death in the family, oftentimes people with Down syndrome, people with other disabilities, just tend to be sort of forgotten and ignored. And that, it really is so much more helpful for them to have a job to do, to feel that they are part of the family's healing process. That, for all of us, that's a really important part of grieving. People usually have heard of the 5 stages of grief, but we know now that there are actually 6, and the 6th seems to be the most important, and it's finding meaning and finding purpose in our grief. And when we can tell ourselves a story about why it mattered in our lives that we went through this sadness, it tends to be really helpful for us, and to be what helps us move forward and accept the changes that we're going through because of the loss we've experienced. So I'm always a big proponent of families, looking for even very simple things that, a child or an adult with Down syndrome can do to feel that they are helping the family to find that purpose, to move forward as a family, because it benefits them so much too.
That's wonderful. I love that perspective. Well, I really want to thank you. Thank you again for joining us today on the podcast and sharing your expertise. It's something that we benefited from. I forget which national convention it was, but you came and you spoke to all of us who do this kind of work in the field, and it was so helpful. And so I'm so glad that you were able to join me and share this information with our podcast listeners as well. For our podcast listeners, I hope you found this podcast as helpful as I did. If you want to ask for any podcast topics that you would like us to cover, please do send us an email to downsyndromecenter@chp.edu. If you'd like to join us in the work that we do here at the center, go to givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center. But until next time, bye-bye.